Assalamu alaikum everyone. Jazakallah everyone once again for joining today. Today we are joined with Imam Tom. Imam Tom, mashallah, has a BA in political science from Wesar College and a BA in Islamic law from the Islamic University of Medina, from which he graduated back in 2020. Imam Tom is also a qualified chaplain and an imam and program director at Utica Masjid in New York. And he also has a great YouTube channel, by the way, called Utica Masjid, which I personally recommend to all of you. Mashallah, the combination of high definition videos combined with the beneficial knowledge he brings is unmatched, mashallah. And so the main reason we wanted to talk with Imam Tom today was because, mashallah, he has a very good understanding of Western academia, which equips him well to analyze the current state of the world, especially as Muslims. And so with that being said, and everyone else being ready, inshallah, Imam Tom, the floor is all yours.
Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salam ala ashraf al-anbiya wa mursaleen. Nabiyyina wa qudwatina Muhammad alayhi afdal as-salah wa azka tasneem. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you. It truly is a pleasure. College audiences are some of the most important audiences to talk to because college is, let's just say, it's close to my heart, the age group that most of you are in. That's the time period when I accepted Islam. It's a time of your life where you're open to questioning things, where you're open to looking at things in a different way, and you're willing to ask the hard questions. And thankfully, I am thankful to Allah that He guided me to a religion that allows and encourages the asking of hard questions. And so I hope that all of you would take in your personal lives this sort of encouragement and sort of a project of asking the hard questions and not being afraid. And so, especially with this particular thing, I know we have a Q&A sort of planned for the end of it. Don't be polite. Ask the hard questions, right? Because that's the way that we get to the truth. And I know different people have different styles. Some people are like, there needs to be haiba, there needs to be etiquette, there needs to be this sort of thing. But that's not where I came from. Like, I came from, let's question everything. Let's put it on the table, look at it under a microscope, tear it down, build it back up again, and see what we're left with at the end of the day. So absolutely nothing is too hot of a topic or off limits or anything like that. So yes, as by the way, quick correction, it's not my YouTube channel, right? It's the YouTube channel on Masjid.
Okay.
Utica Masjid, and that's no shade to Brother Imran, but I purposely went out of the way because I used to have a personal YouTube channel and I haven't touched it in months and months and months, because one of the problems of YouTube and the dawah scene that goes on today is making our names our brand, right? And that's a very dangerous thing for the nefs, because then especially if you're monetized and things like that, if your name is your brand and then somebody wants to criticize you or give you advice or give you feedback, then you have a conflict of interest. And so one of the things that I was adamant about as soon as I came back to the States and I got set up in a masjid is that let's make this the masjid's YouTube channel. And I'll be obviously providing most of the content, but it's not just me. It's the masjid's channel, and I think that that's significant. So without further ado, I've been asked to talk about secularism. I'll start off with a brief quote after I just will give a brief caveat, which is that this is something I can talk about for hours and hours and hours. And so, actually, I don't know if any of you follow Blogging Theology, Paul Williams, but that's exactly what I did on Blogging Theology, is that we've had 4 videos just covering one book on secularism, right? And each of those videos is an hour, so that's at least 4 hours of material. Actually more, because it's usually like an hour and a half.
Yeah.
And that's just one book, right? And there's multiple books that, actually we're going to start a new series, hopefully in November, new series of books. So there's a lot of stuff out there. Everything that's going to come through today is just trying to condense it and crystallize it and make it very sort of bite-sized and chewable. But it's an iceberg, and there's a lot of stuff that's under the water. So if there's something that doesn't make sense or you weren't really clear about something, just again, put it in the questions. I'd be happy to sort of flesh things out, or at least direct you to some sort of source. So I'd like to start out with a quote. And this quote is by James Fitzjames Stephen. This person is a one-time legal member of the Viceroy's Council. We're talking about British colonialism here. He describes the principles that animate the task of the colonial government in India. So these are his words. And he uttered these words in 1883. He said, quote, "The government which now exists in India has not been chosen by the people. It is not, and if it is to exist at all, it cannot look upon itself as being the representative of the general wishes of the average way of thinking of the bulk of the population which it governs. It is the representative of a totally different order of ideas from those prevalent among the natives of India. To these ideas, which are those of educated Europeans and particularly of educated Englishmen, it attaches supreme importance. They are the ideas on which European civilization is founded. They include all the commonly accepted principles of European morality and politics, those, for instance, which condemn cruel acts, such as the burning of widows, or the offering of human sacrifices in the name of religion, or the infliction of disabilities, as, for instance, disability to marry on account of widowhood, or the change of religion, and others of the same sort. I start with that quote because I know that you all, as MSA, you had a talk recently on colonialism, and colonialism is actually kind of the subdivision of my subject expertise that I studied in undergrad. And secularism cannot be understood without the colonial context. You know, we talk about colonization and the colonization of Muslim lands, and we're sort of doing this work of deconstructing ourselves and kind of trying to uncover, okay, how have we gotten to where we are right now? The other dimensions of colonialism are quite well known, right? So obviously there is an economic dimension to colonialism, the extraction of resources, right? The domination and that sort of way. Obviously, there's also the racial dimension to colonialism. This is very well known as well. We talk about genocide, we talk about colorism, we talk about the racism and the racist sort of structures that colonialism left in its wake. There's also the political dimension to colonialism, and that is also well known. We talk about all the time how the British drew borders specifically in order to kind of mess with rival factions of the local population and set them off against each other, you know, keeping them divided and weak and fighting each other and these sorts of things. Also within the political dimension has to do with the installation of regimes, okay, and the sort of political violence that goes on there. But there's another dimension of colonialism that is probably the least talked about, and that is the ideological dimension of colonialism. This is where secularism is hiding in plain sight. Why is it the least talked about? Because secularism is still dominant, whereas the others have all been problematized, and people feel embarrassed about it, and people are still kind of even maybe starting to issue apologies, considering reparations, these sorts of things. Secularism is still dominant, and it's still a force of colonial expansion and domination in the world. The other reason why it's kind of the hidden dimension of colonialism is that when it just starts to get talked about, it kind of collapses back into either talking about race or talking about culture, right? So, for example, if we want to talk about the sort of project that Kemal Atatürk did in secular Turkey, for example, he banned the adhan. He made it forbidden that anybody could sit on the floor. Everybody had to sit on tables and chairs. All these sorts of things. The Arabic sort of influence on the Turkish language was removed, or at least they tried to remove it as much as possible. When we start to talk about these sorts of things, as within secularism, it often gets blurred and falls back into discussions either about race or discussions about culture. However, secularism as a frame and as a tool of dominance or as a political project is something that it goes beyond culture and it goes beyond race. And it has to do with exactly what that gentleman in the footnote that I just read mentioned. It has to do not just with an imposition from outside, but it has to do with changing the way that somebody thinks, changing the way that somebody feels, right? Your sensibilities, your sense of what is good and what is wrong, what is beautiful and what is ugly, your sense of what sort of things are harmonious and which sort of things are in opposition, right? This is the ground and this is the playing field that secularism is vying for. So that makes it the most dangerous kind of dimension, in my opinion, of colonial domination.
Imam Tom, can you give us an example of where secularism kind of changes our way of thinking, yet it goes undetected? So
in
today's one.
We're going to have a bunch of examples, inshallah.
Okay, so.
I'll give you a quick teaser, okay? Like it can even, again, this is an interesting one because sometimes it's so subtle that it has to do with the reasoning that we employ to get to a certain conclusion and not necessarily the conclusion itself. For example, whenever we make an argument for the wearing of the hijab based off of choice, okay, well, it's my choice to wear it. Okay, this is secularism shaping our sensibilities and the tools that we use to arrive at the conclusion. I'll get there later.
Okay.
But we didn't have to use that reasoning. We could have used other sort of justifications.
Yeah.
So why do we reach for that specific justification as opposed to all the others that we could possibly think of? Right. Well, there's a reason for that. And power is in the room, and that power is a secular power. So, okay, we have this sort of situation where, let's set the stage at least historically, because there's a historical dimension to all these things. You have the colonial encounter. You have the European colonizers coming to Muslim lands and other lands throughout the world. And the experience that they're arriving with is the experience of European Christian trauma. And that has to do specifically with the type of religious violence that they were exposed to and that they were used to, right? Anybody who knows a bit about history, the 1600s and after, there was bloody religious wars for hundreds of years. You didn't have freedom of conscience if you were living in a particular political unit. You had to believe the same exact sect as your political leader, and there were often rival fightings between massive bloodlettings and this sort of thing for hundreds of years. So the solution that occurred or that happened historically in European society was secularism, and it was something that was arrived at by factions of both religious people and by factions of people who didn't care about religion. Even the church was happy with the secular arrangement because from their perspective, they were saving themselves from being politically manipulated. And for other people, they were like, well, at least we get to kind of free ourselves from this violence, and we get to try to find a common denominator for society to move forward in peace. Now, that was an easy sort of concession for a Christian society to make because Christianity doesn't have a very robust system of law like Islam does, right? But we're going to see that when the Christian Europeans came to the Muslim lands and other lands, that they imposed this experience and universalized it upon the entire world, right? They assumed that the same problems that they had gone through are the problems of everybody else. They didn't look at the differences and they didn't look at the details. That's giving a charitable reading of what happened. Another thing that happened is that secularism provided a very convenient logic for colonial domination. Okay, this has to do with the civilization mission, right? They come to the Muslim lands and they said, well, look at this mess. You guys have this religious law, the Sharia. It's all completely, everything's tied up with one another. It's all mixed together. We want the rule of law. You have a different law for Muslims and a different law for Christians and a different law for Jews. That's nuts. We need to establish one law for everybody, right? And other sorts of things, but it serves as the justification for colonial domination and the changing of law and the changing of how people actually thought about things. Okay, so what actually is secularism? If you look at people who defend secularism, and obviously all of my videos that I've kind of talked about secularism, I always get people in the comments like, well, wait a second, no, secularism is good, secularism is nice. It's the separation of religion from state, right? That's the most sort of typical understanding of it. It's the separation of religion from the government or separation of religion from the public sphere. But it's not simply that, and this is an important point for us as Muslims. It's our problem with secularism, or the problem that I have with secularism, I'll speak personally, is not simply that it's imposed, right? It's also the substance, okay? Because secularism is not simply actually just the separation, okay? It's actually a production. It's a complete redefining of the entire world, the entire worldview, who you are, who I am, how I think about myself, how you think about yourself. And that redefinition has very much undermined Islam and displaced it. So if you look at the legitimizing myth, what does secularism say about itself, right? And actually analyzing it for the facts on the ground, what it is. Okay, so how does secularism justify itself? We've touched briefly upon sort of, this whole idea of separating religion from society or separating religion from government and the state so that everybody can kind of move on and live life in a peaceful way. And that's really what is the main kernel of the claim, is that secularization or secularism has saved us from religious fanaticism. Before, in the past, in the medieval times, we had religious fanatics, people who believed too strongly or too confidently, or they thought that their way was perfect. And because they thought that their way was perfect, they sought to impose violence upon other people. And the thing that saved us from this religious fanaticism is secularism. It came in and it changed religion to just be a private matter and so they couldn't mess with anybody any longer. Other features of secularism, so we're changing it into a political ethic. Before it was a religious ethic. You organize your society based off of, well, we're a Christian society, you're a Muslim society, you're this, or that. Now we're changing it so society is based off of a political ethic that supposedly is independent of any religious conviction whatsoever. What's our definition of the good? Okay, what's our definition of progress? These are things that used to be rooted in religion. Now they're not. Now we have to construct them socially. Okay, you and I have to have a discussion in a public square or on social media or in a college classroom about what is the good, right? What is progress? How should we move forward? Instead of being anchored in a religious tradition, now it's up for debate. It claims that now there's this public sphere, or this public square that we can have this debate in. So it presupposes this sort of idea of an arena where everybody is able to access and everybody is able to sort of come into it. And you and I can just convince ourselves, or persuade each other to what is the kind of the best way. And then finally, the last feature is that the means, or so that the main method of identification is through citizenship. Okay, is through citizenship. Whereas before we were relating perhaps as souls, right? As a Muslim soul, somebody who submits to Allah, who's trying to get into paradise, right? And now my main sort of base level identity is always inflected through citizenship. It's a transcendent political medium. So this is what secularism says about itself, right? And this is what the sort of people who support secularism as a project, they advocate that look at all these benefits it has given us. We're not killing each other over religion. We're not killing each other about these sorts of things. Nobody is imposing their way upon my life, right? And so now we get to enjoy all these sorts of fruits. Well, that begs the question of, does this hold up to scrutiny? And obviously I would assert that it does not. That if we are to look at this claim under the microscope and deconstruct the sort of triumphalist myth that people tell about secularism, we will find, and this is my claim and not just my claim, the claim of others, that secularism is a hegemonic political project. And it is a hegemonic political project of modernity, not the only one, but one of them. And that the modern nation state has used this hegemonic political project to exert control over certain people, to produce different sort of relations between law and society and ethics, and change the way people think and feel, and for our purposes to displace Islam and an Islamic worldview. And this becomes extremely clear from the colonial context. So if you go, there's a playbook. There's a playbook. If you go to Egypt, for example, look at how the French colonized Egypt. Okay, there's different phases and there's different dimensions, as we said in the very beginning. Everybody understands the economic dimension of colonialism. That's easy. Everybody understands the political dimension of colonialism. Yes, that's also easy. But the ideological dimension is actually quite interesting. Part of it has to do with the displacement of law, okay, and the redefinition, not just of laws, not just of importing other laws from outside, but a complete definition of what law actually was. What was the purpose of law? Who's the subject of law? What's the jurisdiction that law has to play? So this happened slowly. Egypt at the time that the French invaded was actually nominally under the Ottoman control. But even the Ottomans, right, were the subject of sort of colonial advance encroachment when it came to the reform of their law. Everybody knows about the Tanzimat reforms. And of course, the West praises the Tanzimat reforms as, mashallah, it's the Ottomans getting with the times, and it's the Ottomans sort of, welcoming modernity and stuff like that. But, from a more Islamic or Islamocentric sort of position, it's actually quite a sad tale, right? You have the complete reconfiguration of the law along European lines and the complete swallowing of European values. So with the Tanzimat reforms, we have the commercial code that was instituted in 1850. We have the penal code that was instituted in 1858, the commercial procedure code in 1861, and finally the Majalla, which was sort of formalized between 1870 and 1877. Before these sorts of codes and reforms, the Sharia was something extremely organic. It was extremely decentralized. It was extremely local. It was something that paid attention to the differences between, religious subjectivities. It was something that took custom into high regard and was able to sort of intervene and bring these things into the justice system. It was also something that prioritized arbitration and otherworldly purposes of sulh, right, of getting along and these sorts of things, over litigation, right? Like the resorting to like, okay, you're going to have to do this and I'm going to have to do that. This is what the law says. The qadi's sort of judgment was the last straw. It was the last straw and not the first recourse. And all of that changed with the centralization of the law and the redefinition or reconceptualization of the law under the Tanzimat reforms. So the same thing happens in Egypt, right? We have sort of the same sort of process that unfolds. We have the civil code of mixed courts that's established in 1876, and then a separate courts, the Sharia courts, are established in 1880, and then finally the Napoleonic Code was instituted in 1883. So three main changes that occurred in Egyptian society at this time was, first of all, they reduced the jurisdiction of the Sharia courts. As before, the Sharia courts used to rule over every sort of thing. We'll talk about the significance of that in a second. Now it only had jurisdiction over waqfs, right? So religious endowments and family law, marriage, divorce, custody, these sorts of things. The Sharia courts themselves were now bureaucratized. So the introduction of centralization, documentation, and bureaucratization to the Sharia courts, right? Everything had to be documented in a certain way. There had to be certain procedures that were put in place, and everything had to come from the state. So you had the slow sort of, whereas this was previously like a very organic and local and decentralized sort of thing, it became extremely centralized. Now you have the center telling the whole what to do, or the center telling the periphery what to do. Here's your judge that's assigned to you, and here's the rules that he's going to follow, and here's the procedures that he has to abide by. And if not, and he's on our pay now, and we can remove him, which is an extremely different system from what was there previously, where he was in the pay of some sort of religious endowment that was locally sourced.
So with Islam, the goal was actually achieved, and it wasn't just the carrying out of law. But as soon as it was centralized, now the goal is just carry out law, and whether the goal is achieved or not wasn't really the top priority.
Yes, the letter of the law and following procedure became the priority. And it's very ironic if you read the colonial literature of sort of what was the reactions of a lot of these sort of encounters with European colonial officers when they saw the Sharia. They would accuse the Sharia of being rigid, and yet their system that they imported was far more rigid than the Sharia system that was in place. And so if you go through it, I mean, it's really just a justification. They wanted to change it. They needed the means to change it. And there's all sorts of tactics and dirty tricks that they used to actually put the idea in people's minds that it needed to be changed, that it was antiquated, that it was outdated, that it was rigid, that the doors of ijtihad have been closed. All these sorts of tropes, were all part of trying to convince the populace that the Sharia actually required reform, and that the only answer was to import not just penal codes, actual laws from outside, especially from Europe, obviously, but the entire idea of what law was had to be imported from Europe. So the last sort of straw was in 1955. In Egypt, they abolished the dual structure of law, and they finally just like stopped pretending like, hey, Sharia courts, you can get out of here, you get lost, and we're just going to follow now the secular nationalist courts. So that was kind of the playbook. And this is something that isn't just Egypt. If you go to Morocco, you go to Algeria, you go to Indonesia under the Dutch, you go to Malaysia under the Brits, you go to the Indian subcontinent under the British as well. It's the same exact playbook. Okay, so they come in, they redefine what law is, they import their legal system, they say that everything that you guys are doing right now is completely backward. This is a mess. You guys have no sort of system of organization. We're going to take it upon ourselves, white man's burden, civilization mission. We're going to organize it for you. And at the same time, we're going to rob you blind and kill you and all these sorts of things that we already know. Right. So
how are these things able to, how are they so successful in being able to impose this type of narrative upon them? Was it just technological superiority, or?
I'm glad you asked that, because actually in one of the books, in Talal Asad's book, Formations of the Secular, he goes into the collaboration of the elite. And this is something that we can't kind of hide away from. And this is something that brings us from an Islamic point of view, that unity is extremely important. And even you go back to the time of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, you had people who were collaborating from the inside, right? You had the different Jewish tribes in Medina, and you had the hypocrites of Medina that were waiting to kind of hang the Muslims out to dry and get them killed, right? So a similar sort of dynamic occurred all over the Muslim world at the in the time of formal colonization, where you had a sort of cadre of elites that were educated in the West, that were acculturated to Western ways, that saw the West as frankly superior. Okay, and then they were kind of like the guy on the inside who's opening the gates. So they were the ones who welcomed with open arms these sorts of reforms, even would go abroad to try to agitate for support for these sorts of reforms, quote unquote reforms, of course. And so it was something that was completely sort of, it was something that was with the collaboration of certain people on the inside and certain elements on the inside. Without that collaboration, would it have been possible? I don't know. Probably not. Maybe. Who knows? Okay, so if we're looking then, we have this sort of situation. It's a paradigmatic situation. It's an example that was, carbon copied across the world, the example of Egypt and other places. What's sort of the grammar of the changes that are taking place in concepts and how people are thinking about their lives? And what do we know, or what do we notice from how sort of secularism is putting its stamp on the society and how things are changing? What is secularism actually going in there and changing? One of the fundamental elements is that social spaces are now structurally differentiated. Okay, this has to do with separating, or trying to separate, religion from politics and law. Okay, the first thing was the attempt to separate religion from politics and law. The funny thing is, in order for that to work, you have to define or redefine what religion is in the first place. And you have to redefine what law and politics is in the second place. You also have to redefine who is the subject of religion, who's like the actual religious person, and who is the actual person that is the subject of the law. So if you trace sort of how these different sorts of things were redefined, then you actually get to see kind of in real time how things were changing from the worldview that existed before colonization and its concomitant sort of secularism, and then after. So in order to redefine religion, we'll take it step by step. First, they had to redefine religion. That involved creating religion in the first place. Okay, what do I mean? I mean that religion as a category is an invention of secularism. People never used to talk about religion, right? What is religion? What is a religion? People used to talk about faith. They used to talk about belief. They used to talk about truth. They used to talk about what was right before they had the language of religion. Okay, so if you look at a pre-modern, pre-colonial, pre-secular sort of frame, we wouldn't say I have a religion and you have a religion and we all have religion and let's sing Kumbaya. It was like, I believe in the truth from my Lord, right? I believe that this is what's truly revealed from Allah, and you have a different thing, like the idea of deen, right? It's a different concept from religion. And so the very first thing was to come up with a category that would put all of these sort of disparate sort of belief systems on one playing field and make them comparable. Okay, and that's literally the category of religion, right?
Okay.
What makes it make sense to compare Islam and Christianity and Judaism and Buddhism and Hinduism and all the other sort of quote unquote religions out there? There's an assumption there that they have some sort of commonality. And the assumption that they have a commonality is a very secular perspective. Because if you take a perspective within, say, a religious or within a faith-based perspective, they say, how are you going to compare shirk to iman? How are you going to compare haqq to batil? How are you going to compare truth to falsehood, right? And so the actual category, the idea of religion itself, what is it? It's something that defines religion in secular terms. It's a secular category. The commonality of religion, what is it? It's certain beliefs, symbols, practices. And this is there we've secularized, right? And we've put it in material culture. And now this is something that we compare. We can compare this religion to that religion to the other religion. People weren't thinking about it in those terms before the imposition of sort of this worldview. After creating the idea of religion and creating a concept where now we can compare all these sorts of things and kind of put them on the same playing field, we also have to redefine who is this religious person? What is the religious subject? Okay, and a couple things happened here. One of them was the separation of belief from knowledge. This is what happened as part of sort of the Enlightenment project. Okay, so before, when it comes to pre-modern times, we'd say that belief and knowledge are right there together. Okay,
Mm.
I can know something through believing it. After the Enlightenment, we separated off, or say European sort of thought separated off belief over here as the side of emotion, belief as the side of irrationality, belief on this sort of thing. Whereas knowledge is something completely different. Knowledge is material, knowledge is empirical, knowledge is logical, knowledge is all these sorts of things. So we've created two completely separate poles, whereas before they were something more of a unity. This is like the mind-body split. Without this change, it makes no sense. I'll give you a real world example right now. How often do we hear it said, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, right? Without this change in concepts, it's not even possible to say such a thing. It's not even possible to think such a thing. How could somebody be spiritual but not religious? That's something that inherently puts religion to the body, right? The rituals, the symbols, these sorts of things, and puts spirit with the mind, right? Or the heart, or whatever sort of, the ineffable sort of experience. Okay. Before there was a unity. There was a unity there, and that unity was fractured with the Enlightenment and then the secular sort of project to kind of impose that fracture upon other people.
So now the universal language they wanted to impose was that only what's observational or what we can observe and what we can physically like take in as knowledge is now the universal language. Everything else is just like dogma and irrational belief.
Yes, and which necessitates this privatization, and we're going to get there in a second. It's like, so you can have it, but it's got to stay in your bedroom, right? So we don't want society being controlled or influenced or driven by irrational forces, right? And if your religious beliefs are over on the side of irrationality, not knowledge, not empiricism, then they have no business informing what the government does or what society does or these sorts of things. Okay, so that's why it necessitates the privatization. You can be as crazy as you want in your own home. You can believe in the flying spaghetti monster or Pastafarianism or whatever all this nonsense is. But when it comes to matters of state, foreign policy, economy, what are we going to do? The real world. We'll talk about that in a second. The real world. Okay, then it has to be facts. It has to be empirical evidence. It has to be things that are material, because the assumption is the material is real and the spiritual and the religious is all just sort of made up, potentially maybe real, but not really very much. The second big thing, we're talking about redefining the religious subject. Who is this religious subject? Now we've cornered him off. Okay, he used to be somebody who had something to say about how we should govern society. He used to be someone who had something to say about how the world should work, how people should act. Now he's privatized. Now he's just off in his corner, believing in what he does. He puts it on like his clothes in the morning. He can take it off when he wants. He can switch it whenever he wants. It's optional. Okay. The other sort of thing is agency. Okay. The religious subject within secularism or after secularism is defined by agency. And agency is the opposite of submission. And submission is literally the name of our religion. Right. So what's the idea behind agency? Okay, the idea behind agency is, again, that the real self is one who chooses, and that things are valuable in as much as you are able to choose them and select them and decide for yourself, which is where we get to the hijab example, right? Because we might feel like we're defending something Islamically if somebody questions one of our sisters here and say, why do you wear that oppressive scarf? Aren't you like sort of, backwards? Isn't this from, don't you know you're in the West, you're free, you don't have to wear this sort of stuff anymore? And somebody can say, well, this is my choice. Or somebody can say, well, this is guidance from my creator. Or somebody can have other, responses beyond that. There's multiple responses that one could think to say, right? But the appeal to choice is something that still is working within the modern sort of self, the secular self, which is dedicated to autonomy, is dedicated to choice, right? The implication is that if I'm doing it because I chose it, it's okay. But if I wasn't choosing it, then it wouldn't be okay.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
Which is where we get into trouble, because there is some sort of thing where there's expectations, right? If we sign our name on the dotted line, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, I sign up to this religion, then there's some sorts of expectations that have to follow, right? There are some things that I don't choose. Okay, I have to pray 5 times a day. Is that something that I choose? Alhamdulillah, yeah, I personally do choose, but in a certain sense, there's a little bit of coercion there. There's a little bit of sense, well, if I don't do it, then there's punishment for me, or at least I'm eligible for punishment in the afterlife, right? So this is something that is very, very counter to the sense of autonomy that the secular self sort of valorizes and constructs, is that Everything that's valuable has to be chosen by you. This is not something that we're looking to submit or these sorts of things. So the idea that the real self is the autonomous self that gets to choose, it creates imperatives, okay? And every sort of shift in concept, it creates certain imperatives, right? So if we're saying that the real human self is a self that has autonomy, and that they derive value from their autonomy, and they derive satisfaction and meaning from the fact that they choose what they're doing. It's voluntary. It's by their own free will and their own choice. The imperatives that it creates is now I am on a quest and on a mission for self-ownership. Anything that contradicts that self-ownership or encroaches on it in any way, external control, I want to get away from it. I want to rebel against it. I want to undermine it. I want to contradict it in some way. And so the secular self creates this sort of project of increasing self-empowerment. How often you hear about self-empowerment? Again, self-empowerment is good. It's no problem. But within the secular self, it's a must. It's a must. You have to go through self-empowerment, through choices, through rebelling against control that's put on you from outside. If your father is telling you to do something, well, you better rebel against it because that's not something you chose. That's not your autonomous choice. If your culture or your religion is something, or God forbid, the Prophet Muhammad is telling you to do something, that's not something that you chose. You have to rebel against it in order to establish your own meaning and your own worth as somebody who's an autonomous individual. If autonomy is important to the secular self, then other than submission, the other enemy is pain, okay? Because pain is the limit of our choice, or pain is the limit of our autonomy. So for example, I'll give you an example. You go on and you turn on the stove. Okay, we're gonna make some chai, all right? You want to, out of your own autonomy, say, I'm gonna put my hand on the top of the stove, okay? But it's gotten hot. It's forcing you to take your hand off. Yeah. Right? Because it's pain. But the pain forces you to take your hand off. The pain actually overcomes your autonomous will. Okay? So when it comes to the autonomous self and the secular self, that's why we'll talk about it in a second. There's a very, very interesting and complicated relationship with pain. Because pain is the border or the boundary of our autonomy, of our ability to choose and impose our will, do whatever we want, be completely free. Whenever the pain is, that's where we stop. And so there is a sort of sense that pain is this passive thing, that we become victims of pain, that it's not something that we've chosen for ourselves, that it doesn't have any value. The only value that exists from the secular self is in resisting pain, overcoming pain, triumphing, which is why we have this frenzy in our current society when it comes to health, when it comes to extending life, when we'll have people who are old that are hooked up to machines that are for all intents and purposes dead, but they're being kept alive on machines so that we can say that they're still alive, right? We have people, what's the one thing that you hear when people talk about death? And I don't know how much you guys know, but at least the non-Muslims I interact with, when somebody dies, their number one concern, well, at least they didn't have any pain, or at least they went without pain, right? We're afraid of pain. You look at childbirth, and this is something near and dear to me. We have all these sorts of medications and every sort of thing, like so that nobody feels a thing, right? We run away from pain. Pain is very inimical to everything that the secular sort of project is about. When we look into sort of our pre-modern tradition, especially in Islam, but also in other traditions, we find that pain is actually something that's completely different. Obviously, nobody goes out searching for pain. That's not what this is about. But pain actually is a really important source of potential virtue. Okay, we have, for example, the shuhada. We have martyrs, and significantly within those, we have people, mothers who die in childbirth. This is part of the hadith of Prophet ﷺ. He talks about, people who die with the ruling of being a martyr. People who die a painful death, women who die during childbirth, these sorts of things. So it's a completely different relationship to pain. We have the hadith of Prophet ﷺ where he said that any sort of pain or discomfort that a believer experiences, even the prick of a thorn, if you're patient, then it's actually going to be expiation for your sins and wiping things away. This is a completely different relationship to pain. Okay, we see that pain is actually something that is potentially virtuous, or at least it can be met with virtuously it can be lived virtuously, suffered virtuously, and actually be sort of a fertile ground for the development of our own virtue and our sort of building for our hereafter.
Ramadan is also like Ramadan is also like a good example because you're resisting the hunger and the thirst because that's where virtue is in you being patient and lasting these 30 days and focusing on building spiritually rather than physically.
Yes. No pain, no gain. We still have that phrase. We still have that phrase. And, nobody should understand that when we're talking about these big macro sort of movements, that it's not totalizing. It hasn't squashed every single other sort of subcurrent within the culture. But we see that sort of the general direction that the culture is going. There's a really revealing quote by Simone de Beauvoir. I don't know if any of you guys know her. She's a famous radical feminist. And she has a quote that motherhood, right, is dehumanizing for women. And subhanAllah, right? It's like, whoa, wait a second. How are you going to make that claim?
Yeah.
And the idea is her line of argumentation is precisely this, because it's pain that's not chosen. It's pain that is forced upon the body and has to be suffered. This is before they had all the medication and the epidurals and things that they have today. And so she very, very unwittingly summarized sort of the secular sort of perspective on pain and how it's seen as something that can only have value if it's overcome. Whereas within Islam and other traditions as well, pain is not to be overcome necessarily, but transcended, right? Our attitude towards pain can transcend pain and turn it into actually a virtuous suffering, whereas within the secular sort of paradigm, it can only be something that dehumanizes and limits our attitude to pain. Okay, so we're talking, this is all within, follow me here. We're all within redefining the self, redefining the subject of religion. Who's this person who goes out here who's religious? Well, we established, okay, this person, they have a difference between knowledge and belief. They might have beliefs, but they don't cross over into being able to really inform what people know, right? You don't come into your college classroom, right? And you say, well, I had a dream last night that the Prophet Muhammad told me this. That wouldn't be knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay, it would be your belief, but it would not be knowledge. Okay, or you can't say, well, in Islam, we say that we make wudu and we make this sort of thing where we shove water up our nose, and this has health benefits, and maybe you'll get less sick. They're not going to accept that in a science paper, right, or in a medical journal, because religion or belief is not knowledge. Okay, they can't cross over. This is one of the defining things from how we've redefined the subject of religion. The second thing that we said was ideas about agency, right, versus submission, that we've redefined the subject of religion as somebody who the secular self loves them some agency. Everything has to be about agency and choosing, and we hate anything that's imposed upon us from outside, whether it's culture, whether it's religion, whether it's someone telling us what to do, whether it's someone telling us that what we're doing is haram, or whether it is something that is a pain that we're sort of being subjected to that's not chosen for us. Attitudes towards pain, they also inform our attitudes towards cruelty. What is cruel? And this is something that is particularly revealing of the sort of secular era. What appears to us as cruel and what appears to us as barbaric and as sort of unjustifiable, right? It's not necessarily, if you look at kind of the average belief in the air, it's that, well, the past was barbaric and violence, right? You had people just slaughtering each other left and right, rape and pillage and stuff for love, but this is what they say. And now that secular sort of society, secular modernity has come, now we live this sort of enlightened, peaceful existence, okay, right? How could you possibly reject the fruits of secularism, right? Here we are all comfortable watching, me talk on Zoom. It's not so simple as that. Foucault, and Foucault obviously has a lot of stuff out there. He talks about power, and he talks about the difference between pre-modern power and modern power. So one of the things that he says is that pre-modern power is what we call sovereign power. This is, imagine like the king, he says, off with his head. He cuts the guy's head off, he puts it on a spear, and he shows it, and he leaves it outside the castle for days, right? This sort of gruesome display of grotesque power, right? That's kind of the pre-modern power that when secular modern people look back, they say, oh my God, I'm glad that we're not there anymore. Like, what a horrible sort of existence to live in. But Foucault said, and he's someone who's very much enmeshed in secular modernity, he said that modern power is just a different type of power. And he called it disciplinary power. And what he meant by that is that the power that exists now is either it's out of sight and hidden from plain view, or it is an internal power that shapes how we think about things. It's more of a policing power. It's more of a surveillance power, right? Take the prison population, right? They're completely out of sight. They're completely walled off from our consciousness. You've got people who are in solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is even a thing, okay? This is something that doesn't seem barbaric to people. It doesn't seem cruel. The UN says that solitary confinement is torture, right? But this is something that's regular practice in the United States and in other places, right? So we have, it's not necessarily that violence has decreased, right? Or that we're less barbaric or less cruel. It's just that the type of violence has shifted, right? The types of violence has shifted. We see the difference between torture and collateral damage, okay? We have a sort of funny relationship towards torture, you know, in the modern world, because our sensibilities about pain, we hate torture. We hate the idea of torture, right? And to the point where governments have to sort of lie and deny that they do it and these sorts of things, call it sort of different names. We have advanced interrogation techniques and this sort of nonsense that the US government says, right? But there's another level, right? Not just justifying it for the ends to which it's applied, right? Because the people who justify such barbarity, they will always say, well, we're trying to prevent another terrorist attack, or we have to get the information out of them, right? That's the sort of justification. So in one sense, you have, okay, it's not good, but it is good if it gives us what we want. But then the other level is that, yes, torture still produces a scandal in our society, which is good. It shows we're still human. But other things don't. Collateral damage, literally, no one blinks an eye. Right? You have a bomb drops from a drone, and it wipes out an entire wedding in Yemen, or in Somalia, or in Afghanistan, and nobody even blinks an eye. It said, you know, and you have Madeleine Albright, right? The sort of sanctions on Iraq, and you know, she's asked, is 500,000 Iraqi children worth it? She said, yeah. She said, yeah. Right? That's the logic really crystallized, and it's actually the dominant logic, is that there are certain types of violence that are registered as violent that are acceptable to the secular.
They call it necessary evil.
Yes, exactly. They're justifiable, and there are other types that aren't. Right. So whereas we sit here as secular moderns and we think, oh, we're so enlightened and we have it so peaceful. Look, nobody's heads are sitting on spears outside the castle wall, and we think that we've come so far. But then look, we don't even blink an eye when these sorts of things happen. We consider it Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You know, the United States government has never apologized. They've never even indicated that they should have anything to apologize for. It's one of the most barbaric acts in the history of the world. Right. You know, so all that to say is that once we get to today, okay, and the sort of forces that the secular imprint on society, we have not reduced violence. Okay, we have not reduced violence. We've merely shifted the goalposts. We've shifted violence. Okay, what types of violence are considered necessary? What types of violence are considered unnecessary? This is something that the secular state gets to actually decide and shape people's, ideas about. If you look at society long enough, you'll actually see violence popping up everywhere. But some of it's considered necessary and some of it's not. Some of the necessary violence that we not even just approve of, but cheer on, okay, sports, right? Sports is, you know, you see in football, somebody gets hit on a kickoff and it might end his career and everybody's cheering in the stands. It's like Rome, it's like a Coliseum, right? You're watching a hockey game, two guys drop their gloves and they're about to fight, everybody's cheering along. This is considered not just okay, that this is actually necessary violence, this is entertainment, this is fine, right? Science, okay? You look at the how automatically we test things on animals, how automatically we test things on different sort of creatures that aren't human beings, monkeys and different sort of creatures. Toothpaste or personal care products or all these sorts of things, we're going to subject it to lab rats and subject it onto these different animals, and they're going to die and they're going to grow 3 heads and they're going to go through all these sorts of mutations. Why? Right? This is considered necessary. Right? This is considered necessary violence. And we have to ask ourselves, would the Sharia actually approve of this? Would Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually approve of this? I can't imagine the answer would be yes.
So all secularism does is that it assigns very specific definitions to things like tyranny or violence or subjugation, and it just sets them aside, and whoever falls into it is immediately subject to coercion or not sanctions and invasion. But whatever else is outside of it, that's the good part, and that's what's needed in society for human like evolution, and like they'll tie it into all these other good things.
Yes, and it depends on. There's a couple of different factors at play. Some of it has to do with the nature of the pain that's happening in the first place. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it has to do with what's the goal. What's the goal of the violence? Like we talked about torture, for example. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes it has to do with the subject. Who's the person that's undergoing the violence? Okay, and this is something that everybody points out. A black person's life when they're encountered when they have a police encounter and they're shot is not treated with as much worth or value as somebody who's not black. Right, and then we have this also abroad. We see the ways in which Iraqi lives and Afghani lives and Muslim lives and other people's lives are regarded as literally worthless, not worth it. Right, this is a sort of indication of these sorts of things. So and there's other sort of examples. So war, we talked about advanced interrogation, quote unquote. We talked about solitary confinement. We talked about factory farms. Right, another thing with animals, the existence of factory farms. We can just, we get excited about Chick-fil-A maybe being halal, right? And we have no concern whatever about what's the life of the chickens. Okay, maybe they're stacked on top of each other, smelling each other's, excrement, and hooked up to sort of antibiotics and these sorts of things, and we don't care, right? Because this is the influence of secularism on us, right? This is a legitimate type of violence within post-secular sort of the framework. The types of violence that aren't considered necessary, that are considered gratuitous violence, that now, oh, you're the bad guy, you're the barbarian, you're the guy who walked out of the Stone Age, that needs to be civilized, that needs to be intervened against, that needs to be uplifted and enlightened and changed, right? These have to do with things that violate our sense of maybe bodily autonomy, right? Is this something chosen or not? A lot of times it has to do with bodily integrity, right? Circumcision is something that is controversial to the secular self, both female and male. Okay, I actually had I was given a pamphlet by somebody, and I'm not getting into, obviously, you guys, we don't have to talk about female circumcision here because a lot of what people do is not Islamic, but just the idea, talking about from the secular frame, the idea that anything could be done to somebody's body. Yes, 100% Malik. The idea that anybody could be done to somebody's body and they didn't choose that for themselves is something that is just grating on the secular self and all the sensibilities. I was handed a pamphlet by a midwife, and it was trying to actually agitate against male circumcision. And it was hilarious because they didn't know that I was a Muslim. And so sort of the reasoning of the little pamphlet was like, this is an Arab custom. And it has nothing to do with Western civilization. I was like, oh, that's really interesting. Well, I'll go with the Arabs on this one. But it offends against the secular self because the secular self values bodily autonomy or bodily integrity, meaning it being whole, and autonomy in the sense that did you choose it or did you not? And there's a bunch of other sorts of things that.
So the irony is, like, what if someone chooses to let themselves be dictated by an outside system?
Hey, well, then we get to something else entirely. That's the narrative of false consciousness and oppression, right? So if somebody chooses for themselves, and we will get to this in a little bit. That's the narrative. And if you go into, I took women's studies classes, and I actually took classes in feminism before I became a Muslim. And how it is treated, it's treated as this is false consciousness. These people are oppressed. It's internalized patriarchy. It's internalized misogyny. Yes, exactly, Miles. Internalized oppression. Okay, so that's how they account for that.
So that's internalized oppression, but not secularism.
No, of course, right? Because secularism is self-evident. That's why there's a blog that used to exist called the Imminent Frame. It's now defunct, but it was a bunch of sort of academics that wrote about secularism. And I thought the name was really appropriate because the imminent frame, it's so self-evident you can't even see the contours of it, which is why it's important to shine a light on this stuff and try to, that's why Foucault's method of genealogy and sort of like going through the tracing the concepts, tracing the history is really, really valuable to shining a light on this stuff, to demonstrating that this is a particular thing. It's not a universal. It's not self-evident. It's not like just common sense. This is actually a very particular way of looking at the world. It's historically contingent, right? It originated in a geographical place historically, and it has now weaved its way throughout the world due to colonial sort of imposition. And so if it's on people's radar, we can talk about it. We can debate it. We can say, well, I think that this is right and I think that that's wrong, or I disagree with this part, or actually this part is actually in line with the Islamic tradition. But if it's not even on people's radar, then it's normative. It just fills in the background noise, and it affects us, and it even affects how we view our own faith without us even realizing it. And that's the danger. Okay, so we're almost halfway there. So we've talked about the redefinition of religion, or at least the creation of the category of religion, in order for any of this to make any sense at all. Then we talked about the redefinition of the religious subject. Who is that person? Okay, and all the sorts of moves that had to happen to develop these sorts of sensibilities that weren't there before. Now we're going to talk about the redefinition of law. Okay, when secularism came into Egypt and India and Pakistan and West Africa and all these different places, it had to redefine what law was itself, what are politics itself. And the first thing that had to happen is the separation of law from ethics. Separation of law from ethics. If you open up a fiqh book, okay, what's the first chapter going to be?
Tahara.
Tahara, okay? And somebody who's translating Sharia as well as Islamic law, like, what on earth does that have to do with law? The conception of law within the Western tradition, especially after secularism, secular modernity, is very, very, very narrow compared to the Islamic conception of what is Sharia. Sharia is not really even suitably translated as law, because the Sharia represents a unity between ethics and law, whereas modern law is built upon a separation between the two. So in this sort of scheme, you have law, which is sort of the sphere of the government. Okay, the government is what is going to, the state governs law. That's their business. They're up in the law. Okay. And the ethics are an entirely different sphere separately. The government has nothing to do with ethics. Who gets to govern ethics? That's the family. That's the church. That's the individual. All these sorts of private and privatized entities get to worry about ethics. The state no longer cares about being a good person, being a moral person, being an ethical person. You go to take an MBA, right? Or you go to get your law degree, or you go to become a doctor. How many ethics classes do you have to take?
Zero?
Like zero. Yeah, about zero, approximately zero. Ethics has to do, say it, with what should be. Okay, so we can say that this is the distinction, Halaqa says, the distinction between is and ought. Okay, the ought, what should happen. Okay, whereas the law deals with just what is, what should be, or excuse me, not what should be, just what can be. What are we allowed to do, right? How many times have you heard it said when a new technology comes about? Okay, whether it's cloning or anything, sending somebody on the Mars, or Elon Musk's like launching like 1 billion satellites into space or whatever. It's like, how many people ask, well, should we? Before they ask, well, we can, so we will, right? This is sort of the same sort of ethos that we're talking about. So the state governs it governs what is, whereas the ethics sort of covers what should be. So that's one thing. We have the separation of law from ethics. The state has no business about you being a good person anymore. They don't care if you're a good guy or a good woman. They just want you to follow the law and not be in jail. Inshallah, unless they stand to make money off it, then they probably will take a few. The second sort of distinction here that we have is between public and private. Okay. Now, obviously, this is something that had a very, very different connotation before the modern era and before secularism. What was public and what was private? Okay. This is redefined with the imposition of secularism to include and exclude certain things. So if we look at, first of all, okay, who gets to decide where to draw the line between public and private? That's the secular state. Okay, so we often talk about sometimes, well, secularism is about separation of religion from the state, and separation from, the state isn't sort of involved with these sorts of things. Well, sort of. The state gets to decide what's a religion and what's not, and the state gets to decide what is public and what's private, and all these sorts of things. So if you look across the world, and even different sort of expressions or flavors of secularism, you'll find differences. Secularism in the United States is very different from secularism in France or even in Ataturk's Turkey. Okay, where you had, for example, in France, you can't wear the hijab out in public buildings, right? And that was actually true until very recently in Turkey as well. Yet, isn't this public? Or what is public and what's private? Ataturk's laws went into people's homes. You have to sit on chairs. You can't sit on the floor anymore. Wow. You have to eat off of tables. You can't eat off of a sufra anymore. Okay, so we say public and private, and we have this idea that, well, at least religion gets to live on, a healthy life in the private sphere. But then we forget that, well, the state is the one, the secular state gets to define what's public and what's private, and they can define private in a way however they want, and they can intervene also however they want if it seems to violate the character or the sort of the interests of the state. Another idea, so we talk about the public sphere, and the idea of the public sphere is that this is the place where everybody gets to debate upon what is good. Okay, so before, pre-modern, pre-secular, the idea of what was good, is rooted within an authoritative tradition. Okay, if you and I want to argue about what's good, we go back to the Quran and the Sunnah. We say, well, Allah said this, the Prophet ﷺ said that, and we have a debate about it. Now it's unmoored. The idea of what is the good, we can't go back to any sort of singular authoritative text or textual tradition. Now we have to sort it out, supposedly, in the public sphere. Okay, and supposedly this is going to actually be good because we get to talk, and everybody is supposed to be open access. There's supposed to be no barriers to participation. This is supposed to be democratic. This is supposed to be all these sorts of things. Is it? Not quite. Okay, so one of the consequences of socially constructing the idea of what is good is that it is completely unmoored, and so we find dramatic shifts in the ideas of what is good, and we are experiencing that right now. Look at the United States, life in the United States from 2015 on. Okay, very, very different from the United States from 2000 to 2010. Very, very different from 1990 to 2000. Right, the changes are happening extremely rapidly. Okay, and the Prophet ﷺ actually predicted this, that time would kind of speed up. And people usually, when they see this happening and they see the hadith, they say, oh, well, that's just because technology is changing. It's not just because of technology. It's because we've uprooted the idea of what is good from something that was stable and anchored, and now we've made it subject to the public sphere and public debate. So what seems to be good today is going to change, and it's going to be completely different from what's good 5-10 years from now. Right? So this is part of the mechanism by which these things are changing, and changing very, very quickly. The other sort of consequence of this, now that it's in the public sphere, it's not just that there's no shared text that will arbitrate what's the good, it's also that there's no shared common language anymore, right? If, again, you and I are arguing about what's good, how should society operate? How should we interact with the environment? How should the rights of the vulnerable be sort of protected? If we have a common authoritative text, we also have a common language. So we know what has authority, and we can kind of work within that sphere. Within the secular public sphere, there is no even common language. And so now a lot of what we find is the argument takes place on the arena, or in the arena, of language games and slogans. Right? And we see this with everything, whether it's abortion, whether it's death penalty, whether it's any sort of thing. My body, my choice. Love is love. Love wins. Right? We've reached the era of slogans and the era of word games. Right? Because there is no shared language, and so people actually have to fight each other at the level of language, and they have to kind of smuggle in their ideas tucked into these different catchphrases and things like that. We talked about the idea or the possibility that there's this sort of horizontal access. So the public sphere is supposed to at least give everybody access to co-create what is good, co-create what is progress, and then we get to move on, and everybody participated, and that was really great. The reality, obviously, is, shut the fuck, because that's way, way different from that. And that we find that the public sphere doesn't exist in an open access, horizontally sort of oriented way, is that there's a price to pay to get it, and that there are moneyed interests that are shaping the public sphere, who gets to speak, how long they get to speak for, and who gets to listen. So you take lobbies, you take pressure groups, you take think tanks, you take all these sorts of, there are people and companies that actually edit Wikipedia pages, right? That's a wing of their sort of nonprofit. Yeah. And they will sort of and they have an agenda. I don't want to say that. That's a little, we're recording this little, but this is
we
the
can
thing.
Cut that out.
No, this is the thing, right? So influence, okay? Influence, who's shaping the questions that get asked? Who's shaping the terms of the debate? And we see this in national politics to the point where it's funny, right? It's like they're just talking past each other. They're talking on things that are just completely nonsensical, right? Very little substance, because the terms of the debate are already very, 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 very narrow. The terms of the debate are shaped by the media, by the pressure groups, by the lobby groups, right? And so your debate can only happen within a tiny window that's called the Overton window, just a tiny little degree. Whereas if it were really open access, then we could probably talk about things within a much larger sphere. All that has to do with concerns in the public sphere and how the public sphere, the idea of a public sphere is actually a construction of secularism, right? In order to sort of arbitrate what is good, what is progress, and to sort of theoretically include people so that they could figure it out together. When it comes to the private sphere, as we kind of alluded to before, the state, even though the secular state claims to leave you to have the private sphere to yourself, that's actually not very true, because the state not only gets to delineate, right, what is public and what is private, but it also has its tentacles in what's acceptable in private and what's not. So, for example, and you were asking before, like this is the very first sort of response when you're asking about the whole hijab thing. Let's take a different example. What if someone chooses polygamy? Okay, without trying to get controversial here. What if somebody chooses polygamy? Is that not a private decision, or is it a public decision? No, it's a very private decision. We have people who have advocated through the LGBTQ lobbies and pressure groups for similar concessions based off of, hey, you shouldn't have anything to do with what's going on in the bedroom, right? We hear that a lot, right? It's like the government should not have anything to say about what goes on in the bedroom. And yet, there are various types of private life behind the bedroom that the state does arbitrate and does prevent, even if it's something that's chosen, even if it's something that's entered in willfully with complete sort of freedom and information and free choice. With the example of hijab, as we said, you can have something that maybe the outcome is acceptable as private, but the reasoning is either acceptable or not, depending on the type of reasoning you're using. So if somebody wants to say their question, hey, why do you wear hijab? Isn't this thing oppressive? And you say, well, this is my choice. And I say, oh, okay, I respect that, right? Because that's respectable within sort of the secular paradigm of autonomy and choice and these sorts of things. If you said, my father forces me to wear hijab, you'd probably get child services called on you, right? And they'd probably take you away and assign you to a different home. Or, in other Northern European countries like Sweden and Norway, this happens actually a lot, right? And so the outcome might not be the subject of policing for the state, but the way that you get there, the means by which you reach that sort of outcome are not private. Or if they are private, it doesn't mean that the secular state or the secular frame doesn't have something to say about it. So in addition to kind of, in addition to drawing the line between what's public and what's private, and then really getting to shape how the public operates, and also shape how the private operates, when it comes to allowing religion into the public sphere, okay, it's key to realize, and this is the biggest sort of contention with the idea that secularism is just separation of church and state, or religion and state, is that the secular government gets to decide what is a religion and what's not. Which religion gets to enter into the public sphere and when and how, right? So you actually have not achieved a clean separation. What you have within the secular paradigm is you have the secular state that is in complete control of religiosity, religion, and the domains that it gets to move within. The religions that are granted access into public life in various sorts of spheres, they are considered the enlightened, tolerant religion that is the product of secularism. And the ones that are not allowed into the public sphere, those are the ones that are not enlightened, not tolerant, and not yet sufficiently secular. We see this all the time with the asymmetrical ways that Islam is treated compared to Christianity, right? Or even Judaism. You have congressmen who are dual citizens of Israel and the United States who believe that, right, that they're actually, part of their rationale for voting this way or that way on an issue is because they're waiting for the rapture, and they believe in sort of like the second building of the Temple of Solomon and all these sorts of things. Yeah. That type of religiosity is granted access into the public sphere because it is considered acceptable within sort of the secular state. It has been sufficiently sort of given the stamp of approval for being enlightened secular religiosity, whereas something like Islam, if you just run and your name is Muhammad, they're going to accuse you of, wanting, creeping Sharia, and you're going to start cutting hands and all these sorts of nonsense, right? So one is considered acceptable and one is considered completely unacceptable. So to map it, we talked about how secularism redefined religion. Actually, it created the idea of religion in the first place. We talked about how secularism redefined the subject of religion. Who is that person? What makes them tick? Okay. We talked about how secularism sort of defined or redefined law and politics. And then finally, how does secularism redefine the subject of that law and the subject of politics? Who is this person, this political person? Okay. The most key thing to understand is that this is the big flip in how people understand themselves. Pre-secular modernity, most people in the world, I'm guessing, understood themselves as primarily belonging to some sort of faith tradition. I belong to this because they had an eye to the afterlife. They were concerned about what their creator wanted from them. After secular modernity, people relate through politics, through the nation state, right? Through citizenship. I am American, right? You are French. You are. We look at all the maps of the world when we're in elementary school, and they're what? They're homogenous nation states. Egypt is pink, and the United States is green, and France is whatever. And this map has a certain logic to it, right? The primary way, the essential way, the real way that actually exists in the world, the real self, is the political self. Everything else is optional. Everything else is extra, right? You have to relate through politics and through the nation state. And if you want to add religion, then that's your choice, just like you can wear a certain funny hat, or you can sort of have your sort of preferences, but it's not considered essential. This is materialism, or this is a type of materialism. So the essential self is the one that is secular, the body, the material self. The religious self, the spiritual self, is an add-on. It's something that might happen or it might not. The beliefs and the practices are optional. So what does that bring us when it comes to our society and how it works? Everything now is negotiated through politics. Whereas before this sort of essential self, if you were relating as a person, for example, a follower of Christ, and I was relating to myself as a follower of, Islam, then we have to relate to each other on a different sphere and a different grammar with different vocabulary. You as a soul and me as a soul, and you can look actually in the Quran at the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to address people of the book. Hey, come to a common word between you. You believe in Allah and we believe in Allah, and you don't, worship idols and we don't worship idols, and this sort of thing. That's one way of relating things. And so any conflicts that arise have to be sorted out on some sort of common ground this way. After secularism, within the secular frame, our way of relating to each other is not through the soul, and it's not through morality, it's through politics. Okay? You're a Democrat, you're left, I'm right, I'm Republican, you're independent, you're this or that. You're pro-life, I'm, I'm pro-gun, I'm pro-Second Amendment, you're this. Everything is about politics. So you see everybody involved in politics as if it is the real truth, right? It's the real sphere. Some people, politics has become almost their religion, even within the Muslims, right? We get so passionate about activism and things like that. Activism is great, it's great. But is it the realest thing that's going on? Right? The realest thing that's going on is your soul, because everything else in this universe is going to, everything in this universe is going to perish, right? All the political issues you care about, all the sort of stakes that are involved. Yes, we care about justice, but it's sort of the secular influence that makes us sort of see these sorts of things in politics as the most real, the most pressing, the most important things, which is why you see people that actually, again, I don't know if I should say that or not. Let's just say that for some people, they expose themselves that their highest allegiance is to their political platform and not necessarily their spiritual practice or their faith. So this is negotiating things as politics rather than virtue, rather than morality, rather than truth. You can't say to somebody, hey, it's not moral that you do this thing. You're like the once thrown the Lorax, you're smogging up the air, and you're throwing stuff in the oceans, and you plastics, raining plastic or acid rain. This is not moral. He's going to say, mind your business, right? It's legal. It's legal. If you want to do something about it, go lobby your senator and create a law. And until then, shut your mouth, because that's none of your concern, right? This is exactly the sort of world that we get when law is separated from ethics, and when the way that we relate to each other is not through morality, virtue, or truth, but simply through politics. Only after, okay, so we've redefined all these things, okay? We've redefined religion. We've created actually religion. It didn't used to exist. We redefined the subject of religion. Who is that person? What makes them tick? We've redefined law, separated from ethics, all these sorts of different changes, created public and private. And we've redefined who is the subject of law, okay? Only after all of this redefinition will it ever make sense to say that religion can intrude upon the public sphere, or religion can intrude upon government, or religion can intrude or invade politics, or this, or legislation, or this. That statement makes absolutely zero sense in the pre-modern world. After secular modernity, it becomes possible to think that thought. It becomes possible to say that, and to feel actually that this is sort of like a challenge that needs to be dealt with, right? Why? Because that idea that that religion is intruding upon law or government, for example, it's assuming that the secular self is the real self, and religion is just maybe overlaid on top of it. Therefore, it's alien. It doesn't belong, right? It's additional, and so now it's coming from the outside. And it can either be welcomed or not welcomed. In this case, it's not welcomed. It also assumes that society is actually a real thing. Have you touched society? Have you smelled society? What does society look like? Society is also, just like religion, it's a construction of the secular modern sort of era. What is society? You tell me that we have something called society in America? No, we don't really, right? But we use the word society to imagine that we're all sort of secular political citizens that have some sort of relationship between each other that's not religious. So we invented this sort of idea of the secular self, that's the really essential self. We've invented this idea of society that is supposedly there, and then we've invented this idea of religion that can now be seen and felt as intruding or invading upon it. That is the restructuring and the redefinition that took place. What's left for religion? After the sort of the secular onslaught, religion is privatized. Okay, like what's left for religion? Religion is given no seat at the table to shape in a significant paradigmatic way what government is doing, what the state is doing, where we're going as a society, how we should deal with society's problems. If it is given a seat at the table, it's only instrumentally, right? Just like the Republican Party uses evangelical Christianity. Right? Christianity is not paradigmatically shaping the way that the United States is governing, but it's being recruited on specific issues where there's sort of interests at play and these sorts of things. Again, the secular state actually gets to pick and choose and decide. Always ask yourself the question: which has the ultimate sovereignty or power within a society? Is the religion or any sort of religious body given the authority that it can disband the legislature, disband the government, or is it vice versa? If the government wanted to tomorrow, could it disband this church or that church? And obviously, the times we live in, the answer is the second one. Some people argue, and we're drawing close to the conclusion here, inshallah. Some people will argue, well, all this is good. All this is good. The redefinition of everything. We have privatized religion so that people can live more free lives, right? Now they don't have the impositions from outside. Now they don't have these sorts of things that they're forced to believe or forced to practice, and they can choose it if they want. Yes, the secular self is the essential self. The religion is just an add-on, and people should be able to freely add on or subtract as they choose. That should be their choice. Don't we live in a society with more freedom? And the answer to that is that, well, no, is that we don't have more freedom under secularism. We only have a different pattern of constraint, okay, similar to the violence issue. We don't live in a less violent era. We only live in an era where the violence has shifted. The targets of violence have shifted. What's considered necessary violence and what's considered gratuitous violence has shifted. The same thing with freedom. Okay, we don't live in a quantitatively more free society. We live in a society where the pattern of constraint has merely changed. And how we can tell that is, one, because even all of your so-called autonomy has to be negotiated and approved by the state. Right? Look at all of the sort of differences that we have if you want to have a homosexual sort of marriage, or if you want to change your gender now on your passport, or you want to do all these sorts of things. Where were we 20 years ago? Could you exercise that autonomy and be recognized for it 20 years ago? The answer is no. Now you can, and so look at how you depend upon the state to recognize and actually enable your autonomy. If we want to do something according to Islamic law, for example, I don't know, if we want to start a waqf, or if we want to, I don't know, something like that, if we're not granted a certain authority or recognition from the state, then we don't really have the autonomy to do that. So autonomy, individual autonomy, is always mediated through the state. No matter how much the corporations make you feel like you really have a choice, and make you feel like all of your sorts of choices you're being made are really your true autonomous self that gets to choose, and mashallah, all these sorts of things, just me. Really, the choices that are available to you are all filtered through what the state approves of or doesn't approve of.
So most times, populations are just a product of what secularism allows to be, like spread amongst the people.
Secularism gets to choose your options, right? Yeah. Like secular modernity gets to choose your options for you. And the example that we have in Egypt, if we're going back to our example in Egypt, is that, take, for example, marriage. And again, this is not approving of any of this stuff, but it's just to prove the point that the ushering in of secularism does not mean more freedom. If you look at the types of marriages and relationships and families that you were able to have in pre-modern Egypt, you had more options. You had more options than after secular modern state came in. After the secular modern state, they started with minimum age requirements. They started with banning polygamy. They started with, now you have to register your marriage. And again, we're not commenting on the halal haram of any one of those individual things, but we're just showing how people discursively, their sensibility is that, oh, secularism gave me more freedom. That's not true. Secularism simply changed the type of constraint or the pattern of constraint that people are under. There are certain things that you could do before secularism that you can't do anymore. And there are certain things now, maybe you can do some things now, but you weren't able to do before. But it's not accurate to say just more or less more freedom now than before. So in conclusion, we'll end it here. I'm sure, inshallah, people have questions. Secularism, as we've tried to put forth here, is not a simple separation. It's not a simple separation of religion from society, or religion from the government, or religion from the state. Instead, it is a force that produces new concepts of religion, new concepts of ethics, new concepts of politics, new concepts of law, new concepts of even selfhood. It's a force that generates and creates possibility for new experiences of time, new experiences of space, new experiences of cruelty and of health, new experiences of consumption and knowledge. And it creates new sensibilities of what is good, of what is progress. And finally, it also creates new imperatives, whether it's patterns of constraint or violence, what is legitimate violence and what's not violence, or not legitimate violence. These are all things that the secular paradigm shapes and produces. Wallahu ta'ala a'lam.
SubhanAllah, alhamdulillah, that was honestly amazing. I think I speak for everyone when I say that. And so Jazakallah, Imam Tom, may Allah bless you immensely for that. So inshallah, we can begin like the discussion / Q&A type section. I'll just start off with a comment. I think one of the most essential points to take away from this is that like secularism isn't just this thing that's just kind of in a vacuum, that's just out there and that we can choose to ignore, but it's something that actually plays a very active role in our individual lives, in our private lives, and affects us and shapes us, like our patterns of thought and the choices we make, even as Muslims. And correct me if I'm wrong, like a good example I think I can think of is like when a lot of people say, oh, Islam is a religion of peace. And this point is drove into their mind so much to the point where now they're coming across verses and hadith and stories from the seerah where violence was used in a legitimate and just manner to sort out problems of society, but they can't fathom it, and now they're having doubts and they can't really reconcile the two.
Yes.
So if anyone has any questions, you guys can just raise your hands and talk. Okay. Yeah, Sayyid, you can go.
Assalamu alaikum.
Right.
Jazakallah for the talk. It was really good, very beneficial. I really enjoyed it. The one thing I have a question about was, obviously we hear all of this and we're like, okay, it's well and good, right? You have the secular state, the direction it goes into is a bad direction. So what is the Islamic conception of governance then, as opposed to the secular conception of governance? For example, like the kind of idea that I have in head is, like, I've read a little bit of Plato's Republic, right? Like for part of our classes, and like, Plato's idea is, okay, philosophers becomes king and king becomes philosophers, and sort of, okay, we have to educate everyone, right? That's his republic. So what is the Islamic Republic? What is the end goal?
Yeah. That's a fantastic question. A good book that you might be interested in is The Impossible State by Halaqa. Basically, I think that one of the main points of that book, and I think it is pertinent and accurate, is that the system, it's about real checks and balances, and it's about real separation of powers. So we had a system before modernity where is sovereignty located, right? Government is all about sovereignty, okay? Where is sovereignty located? In pre-modern Islamic society, true sovereignty, ultimate power, was with the representatives of Sharia, which were the ulama, okay? How can we tell who has ultimate power, who has ultimate, sovereignty? Who gets to the final say as to, I always give the example because people have this sort of more narrow conception that it's simply about passing Islamic laws. And that's not true at all. Islamic governance is not simply about passing Islamic laws. It's about an entire paradigm, okay? Because if the state can tomorrow disband Islam or the Sharia or the ulama or whatever, then that's still secularism, even if they've implemented every single Islamic law in the Quran. Right? That's still secularism, because who has the ultimate authority? It's the state, okay? What you had before secular modernity is that the sovereignty actually existed with the ulama. The ulama could take away legitimacy from the sultans and the sort of government and things like that. And the government came and went, but the Sharia was still there, and the representatives of the Sharia was still there. And what enabled that to happen was that they were independent. This is the essential ingredient of the waqf system, the Islamic endowments, and how the Islamic endowments were not tied up with the governing structures, and that they were able to fund Islamic scholarship independently, right? And in a very decentralized and localized way. So this is the key. If you're looking to, like, how can, like, as a thought experiment, what would Islamic governance really look like? I think it would look like establishing a robust system of waqfs that fund the completely independent Islamic scholarship institutions, and then those Islamic scholarship institutions get to grant legitimacy or take away legitimacy from whoever is the governing power. That's the very, very brief response.
Jazakallah.
Yeah, Ada, you can go next.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. Jazakallah khairan for the talk. SubhanAllah, I really don't know how I ended up here because I had no idea this talk was happening, and I'm from Canada, but I'm currently in France, so it's completely different. Like everything, yeah. So it's been let's just pause there for a few seconds. So SubhanAllah, yeah, I ended up here. I don't even know why I'm here in France. It just happened. SubhanAllah, I'm here on exchange. I boycotted France for the longest time, and SubhanAllah, just my parents were encouraging me to, go for it. Like, I think you're going to do amazing, blah, blah, blah. So I'm just like, SubhanAllah, it's hard and everything. I ended up here. I'm happy, alhamdulillah. A lot of things are going great. But seeing the state of the ummah here has been so, so heartbreaking. Like, it's completely different, like, to be here, to live here and see it versus what we like hear in the media and what we see. They're like completely different. Like we only hear 1.5% of like what the ummah goes through here. Like the oppression that you see, it's really insane. So I'm just like, I am in political science and I hope to go into politics, which is, I don't even know if I should do that, but it's fun. It's just pushing me so much. And so I had a debate yesterday in one of my politics class, and it was on the caricature of the Prophet ﷺ by Charlie Hebdo, and just a whole discussion around me, just the hijabi, the obvious one right there, the elephant in the room. And so we just went on, and I'm just like going on this heated debate with three white boys who were constantly just attacking, just disrespecting, just saying that the things that you're just like, oh my God, like you would not believe just what you're hearing. But it was really disappointing. So after a 1.5 hour of debate, I had to leave the class because I just felt like it was just a nonsense for me to just go back and forth. And so, I'm just here to just kind of raise some awareness, to just ask you all to just make dua for the ummah out there, just like how the Muslims are here, like just walking on the street on a regular basis, like subhanAllah, the number of Muslims you see here is insane. I'm sure, like, I mean, France has a very huge Muslim population, but mashallah, you see the strength that this ummah has here, and like how modest they are and how like beautifully they represent their religion is also very beautiful to see. But also you see, like, I'm just passing on the street and I pass by, like, in Canada, like, for me, like, I just smile and I see the other hijabi sisters smiling at me, but here you don't see that. There's that like the oppression has like been ingrained in them so much that like you don't see that. Like, it's that the fear is in them. Like, you cannot, like in France, you cannot, if you're wearing a hijab, you cannot work at a hospital. Like, you cannot even be the cleaner there. You cannot work in an office, of course. And like high schools, you cannot wear a hijab. When you enter into a high school, you have to take off your hijab, but you put it on after you come out. So I have friends that are going through this on a regular basis. And like, I just see them like every day. I just saw some of my friends today, and it's just so beautiful and like just embracing it outside, but they can't do it inside. And I mean, in university, like, we're not allowed. I was just so happily excited when I came first day, and I'm talking to administration, asking them like, hey, can you provide me with a room to use for praying? I have my regular prayers, because that's what happening to me in Canada. I would ask that in high school. I got it. In university, we have 5-time prayers, subhanAllah, like Jama'ah. And so they were just laughing at me. They were like, hey, just, Ida, like, this is a secular country, like, we can't do that, like, so it was really, so I mean, I knew these things. I came, like, I knowing this, but it's just hard to see it, like, just present. Like, I just have to run from one room to another to find an empty classroom to pray. But also, like, I have that, I don't know how to explain it. I have the courage, like, not the courage that in me, but because, of course, like, I mean, I do believe in the protection from Allah, but also at the same time, being Canadian has given me that right to practice that without feeling like, oh, I'm going to be kicked out of this school, versus my French friends who are hijabis, who are not, or like just Muslims, are not able to do that. They have so much fear in them to just go to a classroom. They have to make sure it's 100% locked, that nobody sees them do that. So there's a lot that you see that. And I'm just like thinking about like how systemic this whole process is, in the sense that, like, just imagine like how it's like, oh yeah, like, like, you can do whatever you want, you can be free, do whatever you want, but how can I be who I want if you're constantly telling me how I should dress up and what I should wear and what I should not wear? Like, what is freedom? Like, what is freedom to you in that sense then, right? So I don't know, it's been just really hard to see that, and just like the systemic way of like this, like, manipulating the public, as in like just the Muslims are so marginalized here. Like, they don't even talk about it. Nobody even speaks about these things anymore. It's so like normalized, and it's just sad to see that. So I'm just here. So sorry, I'm just ranting here, but it's just been so hard. Just like, I've been really, really upset at just the fact that, not because I was attacked by these 3 boys in my class to like just talk about like just very like heated discussions, but more so like the fact that like the men that are making these decisions right now are just like these boys, that these are also going to grow up, just become like our decision makers. That is the reality of this world that we see, and it's really, really sad. And so I'm just asking if you could just give me some pieces of advice on how I could be a better ally for my Muslim brothers and sisters here, who are like just not even talking about this, because it's like it's been so normalized, and generations and after generations, this will be all completely like closed off, because why should they talk about it? Because nobody hears them out there. So I'm just trying to be strong and do one more term here and leave, but hopefully I can come back strong here, subhanAllah. And any piece of advice from anybody here, and especially from you, Imam Facchine, that'd be really, really appreciated. Jazakallah khairan. Sorry again, I'm just like
No, subhanAllah, thank you so much for sharing your experiences, and may Allah aid you and help you and all the Muslims, especially in France. I mean, just as we said before, within our tradition, pain and suffering is something that is potentially virtuous. So there's the personal way in which to relate to it, but then in the societal way to relate to it. Living in France, I think you see the face of true secularism, or at least secularism taken to its logical conclusion, right? We're kind of spared these sorts of things in the United States because the United States has a sort of traces of religious culture. And so more so than the UK, and the government has sort of traces of religious sort of culture more so than France. The French Revolution and the way it went down was like very specifically like against the religion in a variety of ways that we don't have time to talk about. So you kind of see the mask come off, right? And so that possibility, that's a possibility for anywhere that kind of is guided by sort of the secular paradigm. It's not a completely inconceivable thing. And so you have to bottle up that sort of rage that makes you feel, and you have to let it be the fire that kind of, burns your fire, so to speak, to kind of whatever you're going to do. And I was a political science major, right? So here I am. So there are various ways to go with that. Doesn't have to just be getting into politics, but you have a duty because you know more, right? And the person who knows more has more responsibility. And so if you've lived something, it's more than just reading about it in an article or a paper, right? So when you get back to Canada, inshallah ta'ala, you have the responsibility to use that experience and to agitate and try to push these sorts of buttons and try to push back against things in a paradigmatic way, right? Not just in a band-aid way, saying, well, because if we're going to call people out about freedom again, nobody really cares about freedom, all right? Like freedom is just something that they use as an excuse, right? When it really comes down to it, it really comes down to other values that are hidden underneath the surface that they're not even talking about. Right. So it's not just about let me be free and I'll let you be free. It has to do with pushing at something that's more paradigmatic than that, trying to change the conversation, trying to change the terms in which we can talk about these things, and to advance Islam. Right? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to advance Islam wherever we are. And so you have a lot of experiences, inshallah, that'll help you with that.
Alhamdulillah. Amira, you can go next. Amira. Sorry, I don't know.
No, it's okay. So for me, it's more, I currently work for the state of Texas as a psychiatrist. And it's been interesting because I'm not from Texas. So the move here has been quite different for me. So now that I work for them, when I first got here, I did not wear a hijab, and now I do. And that was like about 6 months into the job. And now it has arose a lot of questions in my personal, but also in my professional life. I feel like now there seems to be more scrutiny in the way that I counsel or things I prefer not to do versus that I do. And then as far as my personal life, I was married young and divorced young. So that's always brought up amongst my peers, believe it or not, who are Muslim more than the ones that are not Muslim, as being an issue of is it valid that I counsel men even though I'm a divorcee, or that I counsel people in relationships even though I'm a divorcee, whatever. But as far as like the secular public, which is Americans or maybe people who are not Muslim that I work with, it seems to have risen up does this mean she's still going to counsel people with an open mind now that she has a scarf? So it's funny because it's almost like I can't please maybe the Muslims that I work with because I'm divorced, and then because I'm a hijabi, my qualifications are taken into consideration and into play as a possible problem. So I don't really know how to remedy both of these, and it's been a very interesting, like just a transition.
Yes, subhanAllah, may Allah make it easy for you and keep you thabit and strong, inshallah. Yeah, I mean, that's a beautiful illustration of exactly the sort of thing we're talking about how the sort of the secular lens gets to arbitrate about who's able to reason privately and who's not, right? So the situation of somebody who you're basically being denied your right to reason privately. The assumption is that for you, your status as a hijabi or somebody who practices Islam is going to lead to a bias, and you're under a specific sort of lens and scrutiny that other people aren't subjected to that same level of scrutiny, just because your faith is a little bit more public, and because of the nature of your actual faith as Islam, as opposed to some of the other sort of more approved of secular religions. Okay, so I mean, when it comes to pushing back, like what are the levers to pull, and sort of the discursive moves to make when you're pushing back, especially against the non-Muslims. Okay, it has to do with trying to apply that logic evenly, right? It's like, if you're going to apply that logic to me, then you have to apply that logic to everybody. So anybody who has, who has a cross necklace on, right? Are they now under suspicion for not being able to counsel in a fair and unbiased manner, right? And a similar thing to your sort of Muslim friends and peers is somebody doomed from their own experience, right, to only be able to speak from, or are they limited by a certain experience? And are we assuming that divorce is a failure, right? That seems to be the sort of, I guess, subtext that's going on there, right? Why is leaving a situation that's not working a failure and not a success? And why aren't the the sort of lessons that you've learned from that experience, a valid source of knowledge that informs your counseling, as opposed to an obstacle that would prevent you from being able to counsel? Right? It's a very simplistic sort of idea about what success and failure is. So I'm sure there's more to say, but that's all that kind of occurs to me instantly to say. May Allah make it easy.
The question I have is about is a lot of times you see in young Muslims as well, is there's this confusion and identity crisis when you're living in the Western world, and a lot of time Muslims will go towards secularism or liberal values, even though Islam will have all the answers. And the question I have is that this is, from what I understand, could be due to like inferiority complex, because the Western world is doing so much better technologically, right? You have a huge migration from the East to the West to come for a better future, because economically the West is doing better, right? There's this. So what would you how would you answer that question to people who have that emotional, like inferiority complex, right? They feel inferior, right?
Yeah,
like, as opposed to the secular world.
That would be Surah Al-Qasas and the story of Qarun. That's our situation. Right? 100%. So you have, Qarun comes out and his treasure is so big that, it takes however many men to lift the keys to it, right? And what does Bani Israel say? Oh, look at this. This is a success. This is Allah's favor. This is approval from the Creator. And then, the earth opens up and swallows him. And then they're like, oh, wait a second. Glad we're not in his situation. Whereas the Riddimat knew the whole time, right? That's our situation. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, throughout the Quran, several points, tries to break this association we make with material success and otherworldly success, or material success and success in the afterlife. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala distributes his rizq to whoever he wills. And for some people, it's a blessing, and for some people, it's a curse. And so, that's the thing, is that we have to come back to that sort of even-keeled mentality. An additional caveat, I think that honestly, even the frame of identity is a trap. Identity, actually, if you look at, we talk about identity crisis, and a lot of people reactively talk about in the Muslim community, we want strong Muslim identities. Well, it's true, but the concept of identity is partly a trap. And why is it a trap? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala spends a lot of time in Surah Al-Baqarah and Surah Al-Imran criticizing the Jews and the Christians for turning their covenant, which is something that requires a verb and upkeep, right, into an identity. Okay, so when the people of the book, they say, we're the beloved of Allah, they have this impetus, they want to try to turn that covenant into something that's fixed based on their identity. Allah loves us for who we are. Okay, well, for who you are means that you don't have to do anything else. Okay, it means that you get to be static, and because of just your identity category that was given to you culturally or given to you through inheritance, now you're cool. That's not how it works, right? Ibrahim has this conversation with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the end of Surah Al-Baqarah, where Allah says he's going to make Ibrahim an imam. And then he says, وَمِن ذُرِّيَّتِي. He says, what about my descendants? And Allah says, لَا يَنَالُ عَهْدِ الظَّالِمِينَ. He says that my covenant's not going to encompass the people from your descendants who are oppressors, right? So as I say, Islam is a verb. Islam is a verb. It's something that requires constant upkeep and constant, re-upping and renewing and rejuvenation. And it goes beyond what an identity can give us. Like identification, we need to see, like, the literal meaning of identity, to see yourself in something else, yes. But we can't just let Islam become an identity, just like other people's sexuality is their identity, or other people's race or their ethnicity is their identity. No, Islam has to be much more than that. It has to be much more than an identity. It has to be a choice. It has to be a project. It has to be an aspiration. It has to be a covenant. It has to be a contract. It has to be a trust. It has to be all these sorts of things.
Exactly.
Abdullah can go next.
Assalamualaikum.
Makes sense.
So, yeah, I wanted to, I'm not sure this is related to what you were speaking about, but my question was that in looking at the history, where do you think that Muslims or the Islamic states or all these countries' downfall went? At some point we used to be sort of a superpower as well. And looking at the Islamic history, you see these some of these most technological advancements came from Islamic or Muslims. You see algebra, that's basics of math, or even some say algorithm, which is computer science nowadays. Coding isn't not even possible without algorithmic formulas. That was came from Muslims as well. Most of medicine also came from Muslim countries. So, back in the days, right after Prophet's and companions' time, we had a lot of expansion or a lot of technological advancements in that era. But from then on, it seems like that, West became more and more powerful. And, secularism, I mean, to me, it seems like the only way to fight secularism is to ourselves become stronger. And in this day and era, like, technology is what makes you strong in power. And so in this case, like, we're in looking at the history, where do you think where we started to go down and the West became more powerful or advanced better than the Islamic states?
I think where we went astray is loving the world too much, and that boils down even to the warning that the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ gave us when he said that, I don't fear for you poverty, I fear for you, the doors of the dunya are going to be open to you, right? And it's going to be too sweet, and that's exactly what happened. Because at this point, even look at the way that we remember our own history, right? You guys know sort of the timeline that the secularist frame has given us to understand our own history. When is the golden age supposed to be? Is the golden age the days of Abu Bakr and Umar, or is the golden age the Bayt al-Hikmah and Baghdad and the inventions and all this other stuff? Look, this is secularism. Okay, it's like they're acting as if the material success is prioritized over the afterlife, success in the afterlife. Okay, so we don't measure our worth based off of technological progress, first of all. And second of all, because some technological progress is not progress at all. It's actually madness. And it's actually pathogenic, right? Do we want to be the first people that invented the atomic bomb, right? No, that would be sinful in my estimation and my understanding of the Sharia, right? So Halaqa talks a lot about this in his books. You might be interested. Again, the Impossible State and Restating Orientalism. Technology does not simply unfold in a linear sort of progression throughout history, right? It's not that just simply catching up, okay? What technology occurs to people to even invent is a product of their ideology and their values and their morals, right? I believe that within an Islamic society, one that is rooted within actually Islamic teachings, it would have never occurred to a Muslim to develop the atomic bomb, because that would be immoral, right? So it would take somebody who has a specific metaphysics that believes in, the separation of law from ethics, and well, we can do it, so we should do it. And these people's, let's test it out on this island in the Pacific, and let's vacate the entire island from all of its inhabitants and completely ruin the island for 300 years because of the nuclear fallout. And then we'll actually use it against human beings and mothers and children in some far off place, right? Is that the progress that we're after? At what cost? I don't think that sort of thing is worth it. So it's not simply a matter of technology. Yes, exactly. It has to do with, we have to be very, very careful about what are the scales and what are the concepts and what are the terms upon which we're evaluating ourselves. Okay, and are they indigenous to Islam, or are they actually a product from something outside and some sort of outside influence? So the second that we went astray is the second that we love the world too much and we prioritize it over the afterlife, because we can't also bend to the materialistic sense of history, that history is just the product of materialist causes and influences. No, Allah is there. Allah causes. Allah can cause the weak to become the strong. He can replace this group with that group. He can make anybody fall tomorrow. It's all within Allah's power, right? And this isn't the same thing. I know some people say, well, everybody just go and pray and work on yourselves and then we'll get the khilafah. I don't believe in that. But there's something that's the grain of truth there is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is in the formula. He's in the picture when it comes to what is happening, okay? So if you take the means and you are serious about kind of, imbibing and cultivating yourself within what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to do, the way will appear once the student starts walking. You know what I mean? But I think that the big thing was getting away from prioritizing the afterlife and prioritizing the dunya too much. I think that's what led, because once you love the dunya too much, you can be bribed. You can be bribed, you can be bought. And this is what happened to the Muslims in Spain, and this is what happened to the Muslims in other places where now you've got Muslims who are allying with Christians, right, in order to sell out their Muslim brothers. That's why you have in Egypt, you have Muslims in Egypt that were welcoming the French in, right, the collaborators, the native informants. How do you get that without loving the world too much, right? If everybody is able to prioritize the afterlife and prioritize sort of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants, then those sorts of things won't happen, inshallah. Allah knows best.
Yeah, assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. So I guess my question was like, just sort of like a historical trajectory, right? You go back to the 80s, you go back to the 90s. There's a Muslim community in America. You had imams, may Allah bless them, like who came from overseas and set up communities here. And then we got into the phase where now we need to have, the Muslim population here that grew up here, that was raised here, like yourself, Imam Tom, like who goes back and then studies and then brings that knowledge back. So considering the topic that we talked about and that historical trajectory and the audience that you're talking to, which is mostly undergrad and master's students, what do you think the gap is that's specifically applicable to these students that you're talking to, that they can help fill?
Yeah, that's great. I think that wave that you're talking about was instrumental in getting us like the ground floor, which is the masajid and community centers and stuff like that. And I think the next wave, what all of you have to work towards and what we have to work towards is establishing awqaf and making the awqaf fund actual legitimate seminaries that produce Islamic scholarship, serious Islamic scholarship that is independent. Okay, that is one of the big benefits. And it's crazy because people look at the map, right? And they say, oh, well, Saudi Arabia, well, it's a Muslim country. And so, and this is a Muslim country, right? Every single one of these countries is a secular country by the strict definition of the term, right? Because the education systems, with some minor exceptions, are controlled by the state. And so they're going to be, you can get a lot. I lived in Saudi Arabia for 6 years, and you can get a lot of good, but at the end of the day, it's not completely independent. It's not completely independent. And if we want to actually bring it back to where it was before secular colonialism, then we need to work in reverse. Okay, so we need to set up religious endowments, Islamic endowments. They need to be profitable to the point where they can fund actual seminaries that are producing not just the name, but actual rigorous traditional Islamic scholarship that's independent from state influences, so that we can start to do this work of re-engaging sort of the local ummah, right, in North America and in the ummah, more broadly. And it's not about leaving behind tradition. No, all the books are there, alhamdulillah. And now they're even more widespread. We have Shamila, and we have all these sort of online libraries, and you can get everything you want, okay? And we can't fake it. We can't fake it till we make it either, right? You see some of the seminaries that have sort of popped up in the United States. Some of them are good, some of them are a good start, and some of them are extremely weak. Some of them are just a repackaging of secular paradigm, or religious studies from colleges and stuff like that. We can do better than that. So we need to have these things independent. They need to be funded. They need to be rigorous. They need to be traditional. And they need to create a scholarly class that's going to be able to take the tradition and use it as the lens. And this is something that I had in my notes that I didn't get to because I didn't feel it was necessarily appropriate. But time in pre-modern, pre-secular time is complex, right? You have all these sorts of pasts, and they're all valid things to reach back into to inform how you march forward into the future. And we have that. We have that turath. We have that legacy that's in the books and in the ulama and in the sort of traditional learning. So we need to take that, and the purpose is not to regurgitate it. or reproduce it in like the sense of we're just going to create a carbon copy, but no, we need to take the principles and the teachings and the paradigm and look at our situation and figure a way out.
Jazakallah for answering all the questions. The last kind of question I had was, it was really when I was listening to when you said something about, forcing the hijab or, circumcision itself being a force, but I want to know, like, how does the secular understand freedom? Because from what I understand, there's freedom to do something and freedom from something, right?
Yes.
And so and also the question I see, I don't know if you can elaborate more on this. I kind of see a hole here, because if the secular is kind of attacking the notion of circumcision and hijab from a young age, then what about governance itself? Because you don't consent to be governed before you're born, right? Like, you're born in a country and then you're governed, right? You don't really consent. So is that not also coercion and force? And how does the secular kind of justify governance?
Fantastic. No, that's great. So so the thing is, yes, you touched on the difference between negative freedom and positive freedom. And so the freedom that we're talking about within liberal sort of society is negative freedom, and that means freedom from, right? The freedom from restraints, the freedom from control, and that goes back to the sense of self, the autonomous self, constantly rebelling. This goes back to Kant and like other people like him, right? We're constantly rebelling against the limits, right? Whether those limits come from family, they come from society, they come from culture, they come from tradition, they come from religion. Our self-worth and satisfaction is going to come in rebelling against those limits and destroying them, and just selecting the things we want. Where does government fit in? Because government invented this hilarious sort of legitimizing myth, which is the social contract, which is one of the most ridiculous things I've ever heard of, but a lot of people still believe in it, right? And I like to give the example, okay, the election's coming up. If nobody votes in the election, what happens to the government? The government just goes home, right? Of course not, right? The government at the end of the day is coercion, and it's got the monopoly on coercion, legitimate coercion, and they're going to be there. Right. And this is also, interestingly enough, an argument against those Muslim students of knowledge and scholars who try to say that voting is categorically haram, right? Because their assumption is that by voting, you are participating in that social contract and you're handing over authority and sovereignty to the state. And that's giving the voting process way too much credit. The state seizes authority for itself and it seizes sovereignty for itself. You do not give the state a sovereignty by going to the ballot box and voting, right? You're just trying to kind of like, it's like you're on a ship that's careening down a river and you're just trying to, hopefully influence like what's on the breakfast menu, right? That's like the only little tiny choice that you're given. So it comes back to the myth of social contract and this goes back to Hobbes, the idea of the state of nature, which is really, everybody's at war with everybody else. And the only way we can live in society peacefully is if people give up some of their natural rights to the state in order to secure their security. So he understood sort of an inverse relationship between freedom and security. And you have to give up a little bit in order to not be just killed by sort of the law of the jungle.
Imam Tom, Jazakallah again for giving us this talk. I know all of us greatly benefited from it. And to everyone listening, I urge you all to, inshallah, explore these topics and, increase your understanding of these issues more, because it's more directly influential on our communities and our societies than we think. And a lot of what we think are just problems that are in a vacuum are actually directly influenced by things like secularism and all these other isms. Imam Tom, are there any book recommendations that you would give to us?
Yeah, there's a ton. I mean, I think definitely that every Muslim should read, probably. I mean, they're a little bit dense, but if you can, either The Impossible State or Rethinking Orientalism by Halaqa. Both of them are very, very important. Wa Halaqa from Columbia. He's at Columbia University. Those are two of the best books that are kind of on the scene right now. And those are very efficient books to read because he takes some of the best insights from Foucault and some of the best insights from Essed and some of the best insights from other thinkers, and he kind of riffs on them and packages them and responds to them. So it's a very efficient book. You don't have to make up too much ground and go back into the whole sort of conversation.
Oh, okay. Do you recommend Joseph Massad? I've read Islam and Liberalism.
I haven't read him yet. He's on my shelf up here and I haven't got to him.
Okay, no, that was a really good book. Kind of when it told.
Assalamu alaikum, Imam Tom.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
I just want to personally say I enjoy yourself a lot. It's rejuvenated my faith in a very great way. And I want to thank you again personally. And I really like to ask you to come to Texas, inshallah, one day, and we can meet you here and invite you.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. I was in Texas 2 weeks ago, but I was in Dallas.
Where?
What?
I was in Dallas.
We
Please come to
Yeah.
Houston. There's a lot of great massages here. And
I was like under the radar. It was kind of a secret trip. But yeah, next inshallah. I'd love to
come down. Yeah, we can host you, inshallah.
Inshallah.
But yeah, on behalf of the MSA and everyone else that's here, Jazakallah again. Once again, may Allah bless you. May Allah allow you to serve the Ummah in even greater ways. May Allah be pleased with you. And also, with that being said, also I would like to thank the Houston Dawah and mashallah, they're doing great work, and there's a lot of great work coming from them, inshallah. And so with that being said, everyone, Jazakallah for joining. Imam Tom, again, I've said this a ton of times, but again, it was an amazing talk. Jazakallah. Thank you so much.
All right. Jazakallah khair.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم وأن احكم بينهم بما أنزل الله ولا تتبع أهواءهم واحذرهم أن يفتنوك عن بعض ما أنزل الله إليك فإن تولوا فاعلم أنما يريد الله أن يصيبهم ببعض ذنوبهم وإن كثيرا من الناس لفاسقون أفحكم الجاهلية يبغون ومن أحسن من الله حكما لقوم يوقنون